係，各位早晨。財政司司長就住聯儲局加息會見傳媒嘅朋友，咁我先請財政司司長發言啦。
各位傳媒朋友、各位市民早晨。美國聯儲局咧就決定加息0.75厘，呢一個係將呢個聯邦基金利率咧由2.25厘咧對唔住啊，各位早晨。美國聯儲局決定加息0.75厘。美國聯邦基金利率咧就去到2.25至到2.5厘，係今年嘅第4度加息，合共嘅幅度係2.25厘。金管局亦都宣布咗咧，同時咧將貼現窗嘅息率咧往上調。雖然美國今次加息嘅幅度同上次一樣，亦都符合市場嘅預期，但係短短喺1個半月之內加息1.5厘咧，可以咁講係41年嚟嘅第一次，亦都係近30年嚟咧好少見嘅。聯儲局認為現階段咧仲係適宜加息，不過會根據經濟數據咧嚟到做決定。事實上，美國今年嘅通脹咧係持續加劇，個通脹率去到9.1%，係41年嚟嘅新高。為咗壓抑通脹，聯儲局需要繼續加息同埋收縮呢個資產負債表嘅規模。但係一方面加息，另一方面咧要點樣避免美國嘅經濟進入衰退呢？係成為市場關注嘅焦點。美國經濟動力減弱，亦都將會進一步牽動全球嘅資金流向，以至到資產價格嘅改變。部分基本面比較弱嘅經濟體咧，會受到比較大嘅壓力。與此同時咧，其實大部分其他嘅先進嘅經濟體，例如歐洲，都係同樣面對高通脹率嘅。好多主要嘅央行都係加快收緊貨幣政策，持續加息係不利於經濟復甦。加上烏克蘭個局勢，令到全球嘅經濟前景係明顯惡化。我哋會密切留意外圍經濟嘅情況。外圍環境持續轉差咧，喺今年餘下嘅時間將會繼續拖累香港嘅出口表現。雖然內地嘅經濟會進一步改善，但係能唔能夠完全抵消先進經濟體經濟轉弱所帶嚟嘅影響，目前嚟講咧都未曾完全確定，都要睇下咧外圍經濟惡劣得幾快，同埋加息嘅速度會如何。對於部分企業而言咧，疫情已經對業務造成打擊，再加上全球嘅供應鏈同埋運輸物流咧都未完全暢通，持續加息意味住資金嘅成本咧會上升，會令到經營更加困難。此外，金融狀況趨緊，資產價格會比較波動，甚至會調整，亦都會影響我哋本地嘅消費嘅情緒同埋投資信心。香港嘅經濟基本面穩固，經常帳長期錄得盈餘，財政儲備亦都豐厚，外匯儲備龐大，絕對有能力係應對外來嘅任何衝擊。而且我哋嘅金融體系成熟穩健，能夠處理大量嘅資金進出。事實上，儘管美國過去幾個月大力度收緊呢一個貨幣政策，香港金融市場一直都係運作暢順有序，冇出現任何混亂嘅情況。睇下大家有啲咩問題？
如果繼續加息，請問喺繼續加息嘅情況之下咧，會唔會擔心對香港嗰個銀行嘅壞帳啊，或者係樓市咧，都會有一個好大嘅衝擊咧？咁另外你都提到咧，就話外圍經濟可能咧都會有衰退嘅，咁擔唔擔心話香港同時都會有一個衰退嘅現象咧？
美國持續加息，咁咧就香港嘅利率無可避免咧都會喺聯繫匯率制度之下都會趨升。銀行嚟講咧，銀行嗰個流動性非常之穩健，流動充足率咧係158%， 國際嘅要求只係100%啫。資本充足率咧係20%，國際嘅要求只係8%。壞帳嘅撥備率咧，喺到5月底嘅時候咧，大概係0.98%，其實係好低嘅。咁可以咁講，香港嘅銀行咧嘅經營咧係相對穩健，銀行體系咧係穩固嘅。所以剛才提到美國加息對我哋銀行體系會否造成衝擊？對銀行嚟講，會唔會造成個別銀行嘅風險嘅情況呢？我哋覺得咧呢一個風險係非常之低嘅。第二咧就提到對我哋經濟嘅影響，剛才有介紹咧，就係下半年呢個外圍經濟環境會轉差，咁咧會影響咗內地對先進經濟體嘅出口，自然咧亦都影響我哋嘅出口，推動我哋經濟嘅增長咧係三頭馬車，出口、消費同埋投資。消費嗰方面咧，疫情如果能夠大致受控嘅話咧，我哋8月咧就有消費券推出，相信咧對消費會有一定嘅提振作用。而我哋參考舊年下半年嘅經驗，當個疫情受控，大家出翻嚟消費，社會活動大部分恢復正常嘅時候咧，其實我哋恢復經濟動力個力度都係大嘅。總嘅嚟講咧，就下半年嘅經濟表現喺疫情平穩嘅情況之下咧，估計會好過上半年。全年嚟講咧，就政府經濟顧問都檢視緊一啲經濟數據，同埋評估緊個經濟前景。估計無可避免地咧，我哋全年個經濟增長咧會略為向下調整一下。呢一個咧就等呢個評估完咗之後，大概8月中嘅時候咧就會同大家公佈。
Hi, Mr. Chan. So now there are threats of global recession, and some analysts predict that Hong Kong Q2 GDP might see another contraction. So we are technically raising rates just at the wrong time. What's the impact of raising rates on the Hong Kong economy, and do you see the Hong Kong government having to downgrade your annual growth outlook? Thank you.
The increase in U.S. interest rate under the linked exchange rate system will impact on our interest rate. So over the past 2 months, you have seen the interbank interest rate has risen, although the prime rate remain intact. The rate of increase and the magnitude of increase in interest rate depends very much on the liquidity in the market and also the liquidity of individual banks. At the moment, we estimate that under the linked exchange rate system, when U.S. interest rate continue to hike, unavoidably, we have to increase the interest rate. But the pacing and the magnitude need not be on a lockstep basis. The impact of increase in interest rate on our economy is that with the increasing interest rate in the U.S. as well as many of the developed economies, the external economic situation will continue to worsen. So the export performance of Hong Kong will naturally be affected. But on the other hand, if the COVID situation is largely under control, private consumption with the launch of the second phase of the consumption voucher will have increased momentum in the second half of this year. So by and large, our assessment is that the economic performance of Hong Kong in the second half would be better than the first half. But taking the year as a whole, unavoidably we may need to revise our GDP forecast, growth forecast. At the moment, the government economist is examining various data and doing an assessment on the economic outlook. The details will be announced in the middle of August. As to the impact of the increase in interest rate on the property market, Naturally, with increased interest rate, the mortgage payment of homeowners will be increased. But we consider that the basics of our property market remain very sound. If I may share with you some figures. For new mortgages, on average, the loan-to-asset ratio is only 50-some%. And the repayment of individual homeowners, the amount of repayment as a percentage of their income, I mean the mortgage service payment, for new mortgages, usually average is about 37%. And when the banks grant mortgage loans, they have to do a stress test on the borrower. And under the stress test assumption, an increase in interest rate of 3% is assumed. And the borrower need to demonstrate his ability to withstand this stress test. The maximum mortgage service payment to income ratio is about 60%. So with all this, we think, although with the increase in interest rate, the repayment burden become a little heavier, but the staying power of homeowners and the ability to service mortgage remain very sound. Looking back over the past 6 months, with COVID, with the expectation of increasing interest rates, the property market remained pretty calm. In terms of price, residential properties overall in the past 6 months came down by about 3%. And the transaction volume came down about 10%. I think going forward with all the safeguard measures that I've mentioned and the strong underlying demand for home ownership, the basic of our property market remain resilient, although the sentiment would be dampened because of the increased mortgage payment and the expectation of the rate to go up further. Yeah, thank you.
係最後一題嚇，前面呢位女士。
Thank you. Can I ask about the recent financial woes of mainland property developers? Do you think that will further squeeze Hong Kong banks' funding positions? Thank you.
Yeah. We have well, your question is about the borrowing of the mainland developers and the financial position of these borrowers impacting on the Hong Kong banking system, right? Do I have your question right? Yeah. We have been monitoring this situation very carefully, and we do not find cause for alarm. Basically, for the mainland developers, they borrow from our banks. They have to provide collaterals. And the bank have been adopting a very prudent lending policies with regard to all these mainland developers. As I mentioned earlier, looking at the liquidity position of the banking industry, which is looking at the capital adequacy of the banking sector, and looking at the classified loan ratio currently, we consider that the impact of the mainland developers' financial difficulty would have very limited and little impact on the banking stability of Hong Kong. Yeah.
OK， 多謝各位。
唔該。